thank you so much for this invitation and for everything I've heard. I haven't ever, okay, that's not fair to say, but I haven't thought about myself as an art writer or art critic, so this was a great opportunity, so thank you. And now I think I want to change my title of my little spiel. I have no images, so you can leave that one. That's totally great. I was going to say the title was going to be on the necessity of writing, and now I think on the criticality of writing or something like that, or on the crisis of writing maybe. Okay, so like many folks here, I come from a tribe of hyphens and commas. I'm an activist, scholar, artist, and filmmaker. I'm a partner, a feminist, an assistant professor, and a member of the ISO. I have too many degrees. I do many different things. As a politically engaged cultural producer, I circulate between a number of worlds. But today, it seems to me mostly, and perhaps most importantly, I'm a writer. For it is my role as a writer, something I don't do nearly enough, that I find most important and necessary, maybe even critical. The task of writing is something that I find very difficult, but I believe that through it, I have the opportunity to contribute most effectively to a variety of contemporary discourses, to the movements, practices, and communities that I hold most dear, that I want to build and advance, to members of the tribe of hyphens and commas that I know, and to a much vaster range of politically engaged cultural producers that I don't know. I believe that my task as a writer is to teach other writers, to quote Walter Benjamin. That is, to transform what it means to write and think and work as part of and in solidarity with social movements, and to offer dialectical models of analysis. That is, to supply historical context, to situate various practices within a broader political framework, to make public the insights of my experience in and with projects and groups, and perhaps most importantly, to name what hasn't yet been named, to identify emblematic works that are symptomatic of particular trends or approaches or politics, to say some things that aren't being said in order to be useful. So in short, and this is just following, it's almost like a stream of consciousness that this panel is to me at least. In short, I see my role as someone who needs to both assess and theorize aspects of the practices of cultural production, to make sense of them and to understand their role within social, cultural, and economic conditions. I see this as my role as a writer because I live between political organizing and scholarship and art making. And it is what I gather from one experience that helps me to see more in the other and to say something in writing. For I do believe that social practice and the realm of art making can teach us lessons for movement building, as it can offer a space for reflection and encounter away from the tyranny of certain questions and some responsibilities. Starting in 1999, 16 Beaver was such a place for me. Actively organizing against the sanctions against Iraq during the Second Intifada, the reading groups we had in Lower Manhattan were a site of self-education and encounter between artists, mostly. Almost everyone who was in that space in New York City in 1999 to, say, 2001, I would say, actually, identified as an artist or a critic. We developed a practice of discussion and conversation that has been replicated many places, and we carved out a space for dissent and non-institutional alliance that was nowhere to be found in New York at the time. But there were difficulties, and the politics of the practice, the space taught me, showed me things that were different from my organizing meetings. And over the years, I came to realize that I needed to find ways to write about those lessons learned, to articulate quite publicly not just criticism, but to understand what was being produced and reproduced in that milieu, and to find a way to talk about about it in ways that might help others to understand their own experience of sexism, class privilege, of ego, and of things that couldn't be named so easily in all of these discussions we love to have. The first title for the essay that became a practical guide to vulnerable accumulation the first title I gave it was Better Left Unsaid. And it was because I was bringing out tales out of school, the things that weren't talked about, or at least I wanted to name the problems and the encounters, and to think about them not simply as a criticism of the social exchanges or the practice that I was involved in building and that I was committed to. That the social practice I had participated in, even though I have to say, and this, I guess the category of art is something that I struggle with, but at no point did 16 Beaver ever refer to itself as an art project. We really, like the 16 Beaver, maybe now it's deployed differently, but for the first 10 years, we're very clear that what we were doing, it was not social practice or art. It was like we made a space. Maybe it was, it was a social experiment. That's the term we actually used. But it was a platform. So that was the term we liked the best. But rather, so I wanted to, I'll start back with that sentence, and to think about not just as a criticism of the social exchanges I was having in that particular space, but rather as something that shared quite a lot with my experiences in movements as an organizer, and to begin to find a way to name the contradictions of particular aspects of trying to organize and transform the world in this system that is so unjust and violent. To some degree in all of my writing, it has been my experience as an activist that has provided my sense of the necessity to write about social practice. But unlike Ben Davis and his first iteration of his critique of social practice in the International Socialist Review, I have kind of focused my work on speaking to artists and other practitioners rather than to activists. That wasn't my intention in the beginning, but I guess it's the way it is now. To a great degree, this telling tales out of school is one of the most important aspects of my own writing, in part because I come from a political tradition in which democratic centralism means assessment, and that's crucial to all forms of action, discussion and debate. We act, and then we assess with a sobriety and intention not for destruction, but for doing better. Involving more people, getting further, knowing more about the structures of power that we're challenging, aggregating more power between us. Assessment in the realm of art practice doesn't always go like that, because we have different models of relating to artists themselves and to the work. My two examples in this are, I kind of take as the difference between T.J. Demos and Claire Bishop. One of these critics is friends with artists and chooses to maintain his relations with them not through boosterism, but by choosing not to write about works that he doesn't like. Whereas Claire is not friends with artists. That's all I need to say. Being part of the work I've written about means something a bit different for me. But I've also had the experience of writing critically about Mark Tribe and having an extremely uncomfortable series of encounters with him as a result. Because we were friendly prior to the publication of my piece, that was called New Left-Wing Melancholy. And in that you can, if you, looking back, I wouldn't change a word of my critique or essay. It needed to circulate. It needed to name what wasn't being said about Mark Tribe's piece, the Port Huron Project. But I would have given Mark a copy before it went to print, which I didn't do. And it's a practice I know that other critics use, and I think I will do that from here on out. I'm not, but I'd love to hear more about that because it's a really, friendship as method, critical distance as method, or something in between. But as I say, as I wrote that this morning, I was thinking, I'm making this point about it needed to be said. Mark Tribe needed to be taken down. And I have to say, from this vantage point of many years later, embarrassingly, some part of me still believes that. That to offer an alternative way of looking at certain approaches to archival material with respect to movements. That I needed, and what I did in that case was I went and researched the speeches that he drew from the internet. I went to the Tamiment Library and to the archives of SDS and supplied and recontextualized the speeches that he downloaded. And so I needed to do that, and I wanted to do that, right, in order to provide some context for those speeches, but also to be able to offer a reconsideration of some of the politics of reenactment that at the time and continues to be something which is extremely prominent in the realm of both social practice and other forms of art practice. What's my time? Okay. But I also know that we live in the real world. So I felt like I needed to take him down, right? But there's money and capital at stake. There's tenure and health care on the line. And these are my considerations. I'm writing for tenure as much as he was making art for tenure. We're lucky enough both to be employed by universities, and that's a real, also something to bring up about this question that we're posing. But I still want to hold. But no movement can get better if there isn't criticism. So if we don't learn from the past, and to some extent, the opening that social practice allows for, especially when it allies itself with social justice work, with social movements and political organizing, is that it provides an opportunity for some of the histories of political organizing to find their way to different audiences. So a writer, so I'm going to just end with my quote from Walter Benjamin. So this is from the authorless producer, and looking back at it, I think that it's an amazing quote to just maybe end with. He writes, a writer who does not teach other writers teaches nobody. The crucial point, therefore, is that a writer's production must have the character of a model. It must be able to instruct other writers in their production, and secondly, it must be able to place an improved apparatus at their disposal. This apparatus will be the better, the more consumers it brings in contact with the production process. In short, the more readers or spectators it turns into collaborators. It's that quote, that's the end of the quote, it sounds like a ringing endorsement for social practice, for understanding writing as a social practice. But I think it's, as a good dialectical materialist, I have to remind you that the question Benjamin was asking was in the face of fascism: how can art be useful to the movement? And I'm not exactly sure if this is the question I've been asked. And I don't think I want to ask that question or answer it. I definitely don't want to answer it. You guys can answer that. But I do have to say that my experience and commitments to movement building certainly have made it easier for me to begin to assess my role as a writer, and to push me to want to be that kind of cultural producer who might be able to offer different kinds of models and different ways of thinking about writing about the cultural space that's separate from, though connected to, despite whatever claims or there are about social practice. So, thank you.